Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, you know, for 14 videos now, I have been responding to and refuting the book by Dr. Kenneth Gentry, Have We Missed the Second Coming? Needless to say, there are a lot of other things that I could address from Mr. Gentry's book. I've been addressing some of his claims about the Olivet Discourse, and I haven't covered all of them. In fact, I'm reading here and looking at pages 79 and following, and he talks about argument from temporal markers, argument from demonstrative distinction, argument from observational prospects, argument from multiple days, argument from deceptive fears, argument from social contrast, argument from flight opportunity, etc. Now, if you want my responses to each one of those points, you might get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. But what I want to do in this video, video number 15, and this will be our very last video. I'm not going to address each and every point here in additional videos. But I want to address what is to me, and what obviously must be, in Kenneth Gentry's theology, a foundational, critical issue. Now remember, here's Dr. Kenneth Gentry's position. In Matthew 24:3, the disciples asked about two events: Christ's coming in AD 70 and the end of the world. Now, I've shared with you, Kenneth Gentry assumes, without offering a word of proof, not a keystroke, that the disciples were thinking about the end of the world, the end of human history. Guess what? There's no support for that. But that's his first assumption. Building on that assumption, Dr. Gentry then proceeds to find these so-called distinctions, these so-called contrasts between AD 70 and the so-called end of the world. And he finds that pivotal point of distinction in Matthew 24, verse 36. He claims that in the verses leading up to that, Jesus is talking about those days, i.e. the days of the fall of Jerusalem. He overlooks the fact that verses 29 to 31 have a pivotal or a crucial or a climactic that day. The term is not used, but the concept is most assuredly there. And so his distinction between those days and that day is a false distinction. But his premise is that verse 36, but of that day and hour knows no man, not the Son, but the Father only, must refer to a different day. And everything after Matthew 24:36, all the way through chapter 25, verse 46, refers to the end of time. Now, if I can demonstrate from chapter 25 that Jesus never discussed the end of time, if I can demonstrate that in Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 25, which Dr. Gentry says must be the end of the world, but if I can demonstrate that Matthew chapter 25, any of it, really, is actually talking about AD 70, then guess what? I have destroyed the very foundation of Dr. Gentry's eschatology. With that in mind, notice that in Matthew chapter 25, 1 to 13, Jesus tells the parable of the 5 wise, the 5 foolish virgins, and the coming of the bridegroom for his wedding. Now remember, according to Dr. Gentry, this absolutely must refer to the so-called end of time, because Matthew 24:36 all the way through chapter 25:46 is end of time. So Matthew 25, 1 to 13 is about Christ's coming for his wedding. Houston, we have a problem here for Dr. Kenneth Gentry. Let me read to you a couple of quotes from different works by Kenneth Gentry having to do with the wedding of Christ. In his book, He Shall Have Dominion, in the 2009 version, page 420, Dr. Gentry says that the New Covenant bride, quote, totally supplants Israel in AD 70, unquote. Do you catch the power of that quote? Dr. Gentry is saying that the wedding of Christ with the church took place in AD 70. Furthermore, in his book, he continued to say, John, in Revelation 21, 1 and following, John sees the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven to earth in the establishment of Christianity. Revelation 21, 1 to 2. This was the heavenly city that Abraham ultimately sought beyond the temporal and typical promised land. Hebrews 11, 10. And this is it, once again, in his book, He Shall Have Dominion, page 147. He then adds, quote, the heavenly Jerusalem is the bride of Christ that comes down from God to replace the earthly Jerusalem, Revelation 21, 2 to 5, in the first century. With the shaking and the destruction of old Jerusalem in AD 70, the heavenly recreated Jerusalem replaces her. Page 367. He then insists, quote, it seems clear from the time statements in Revelation following the New Jerusalem imagery that this must come to pass not long after John wrote. Revelation 22, 6, 7, and 10, and that's on page 147, note 44. So, here's the conclusion of this, my conclusion. Christ did not simply betroth the church in AD 70, He married her. The New Covenant bride fully supplanted the old in AD 70. But the marriage was to be at the second coming. Matthew 25, 1 to 13. Therefore, the second coming of Christ, when Christ was married, not betrothed, was in AD 70. Now, let me drive this home. In his newer book, entitled Navigating the Book of Revelation, published in 2010, on page 177, Dr. Gentry says this, quote, despite initial appearances, Revelation 21 and 22 does not speak of the consummate new creation order. Guess what? It happened in AD 70. Well, Revelation 21 is the wedding of Christ. But Matthew 25 is the wedding of Christ at His second coming. Kenneth Gentry says Matthew 25 is the final coming of Christ. Do you catch the power of this? Unless Kenneth Gentry is going to take the position that Christ will get married twice at two different comings, then his repeated affirmation that Christ married the church at His coming in AD 70 proves that Matthew 25, 1 to 13, Christ coming for the wedding, was in AD 70. That thus destroys completely, definitively, irrefutably his contention that Matthew 24 and 25 is discussing two subjects. It destroys every argument that he made about Matthew 24:36 being a dividing line. Dr. Gentry would then have to back up and to say, and look, that's perfectly fine. There's no problem changing our positions if the evidence demands it. I've been wrong lots of times. I've changed my position lots of times. So, integrity actually demands that we do change our position when the evidence demands it. But Dr. Gentry basically was staking his eschatology and his refutation of covenant eschatology, i.e. full preterism, true preterism, was staking his position on a divided Olivet discourse. But the fact that Matthew 25, 1 to 13 is about the wedding of Christ at his coming. And that Kenneth Gentry, in his own quotations, posits the wedding of Christ at the coming of Christ in AD 70, refutes his own eschatology. And drive this home. In Matthew 22, Jesus told a parable of the kingdom. A great man, a great king, made a great wedding banquet for his son. He sent out his servants to call those who had already been invited. They began with one accord to make excuse. They mistreated the servants. They mistreated them. They beat them severely. They killed them. The master of that wedding, who had sent them out to say, all things are ready, come to the feast. He was angry, sent out his armies, and he killed those wicked men and burnt their city. You know, as Donald lost the name. It's in the Word Biblical Commentary behind me. Donald Hagner said, it is impossible to read Matthew chapter 22, verse 7 and not think of AD 70. Well, amen. Okay, so what happened when the city was destroyed? The wedding took place. So the wedding of the Son would take place at the destruction of Jerusalem. But the wedding would be at the second coming of Matthew 25, 1 to 13. Therefore, the second coming of Christ for the wedding was at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. As I said, Kenneth Gentry essentially staked his entire argument, I mean, not every bit of it, but a major portion of his attempt to refute covenant eschatology on a divided discourse. And yet, his own position on the wedding of Christ taking place in AD 70 refutes that view, and Matthew chapter 22, Jesus' own words in placing the wedding, therefore the second coming, at AD 70 is irrefutable. And that means that Kenneth Gentry missed the second coming. Thank you so very, very much for joining me for this series in response to Kenneth Gentry. Thank you for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. And if you wanted even more thorough response to much of Kenneth Gentry's work, go to my website, donkpreston.com and bibleprophecy.com, and get my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. You will be absolutely amazed at how inconsistent and self-contradictory Dr. Kenneth Gentry is in his doctrine of eschatology. If you'll go to there and order the book and send me a note saying you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll refund your shipping, saving you $5. Okay, thanks so much. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you on Monday.